Alright, let's start a new video. Sorry if this is a bit late, but we'll get it done anyways. So today, I shall critique Woodrow Wilson's policies. Now, you may notice a theme. I'm going to start doing a bit more of a critique of other people who were in the past and had policies to essentially elaborate on both my positions and why I think these people did good or bad and explain the policies. So, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. He was our president during World War II, not World War II, World War I, sorry. And his reign was from 1913 to 1919. Now, what is it that's so wrong with his policies? Let's ignore what he did as governor of New Jersey, though, to be fair, what he did as governor of New Jersey was awful, including eugenics. Yeah, he actually signed a bill involving people with Down syndrome, preventing them from having kids through sterilization. But what we really want to look at is him as a president, because well, New Jersey was one thing, and you have to acknowledge, at least in part, that as the governor of New Jersey, he was under pressure from his state. As president, you're given a lot more freedom in general. That's not to excuse it, but regardless. So, what did he do that was so wrong? Well, let's start with segregation. Now, pretty obvious, segregation is a bad decision, especially in the government. It is also expressly illegal, according to the Constitution. The government is not allowed to treat people differently based on a race. Now, under the Civil Rights Act, it can, because of things called disparate impact, but let's ignore that because that is an entire separate deal. But the government, by the Constitution, cannot discriminate based on race, because it is to treat people equally. Remember, Constitution is mainly to limit the government's powers and the states, defining borders and boundaries of what they can and can't do. Federal segregation, which Wilson sponsored, was expressly unconstitutional. Now, the Plessy decision disagrees, but Plessy has been overruled, so I can safely say, no. It is still unconstitutional. Now, he also, I was going to write streamed, but it'd be more accurate to say screened. He screened a movie called A Birth of a Nation. Or Birth of a Nation. I forgot if there's an A in there, but we're including it anyways. And what this movie was basically a movie supporting the South and the Klan, especially the Klan. And it was a very racist movie. Now, for the time, some level of that is expected. But not only screening in the White House, one of the first times, if not the first time, a movie was screened in the White House, but letting them quote you in it, and then saying that the movie was good, is generally seen as an endorsement of the things inside of it. That is a very, very bad thing to do. And indirectly or directly led to the rise of the second KKK. I shouldn't need to explain why letting the Klan grow even larger is a bad thing, especially when a lot of their actions were terroristic in nature. Whether or not you agree with the Klan, which I would hope you don't, whether or not you agree, the fact that they use terrorism is not something that a president should support, I would hope. Another big thing is false neutrality. Now, due to the fact that World War I happened during the majority of his presidency, naturally, a large portion of the presidency that Wilson had was sucked up by the war and what he should do in regards to it. Now, Wilson's official stance was that people should be neutral. The people, the president, and every other part of the government should be neutral in the war. What did he actually do? Well, he objected to Germany's naval blockade, despite fully supporting the UK's, lent out loans to the UK and other Entente powers, and regularly traded with the Entente, including weapons. the HMS Lusitania, a British merchant ship, had American weapons that were being sent to the UK. It's no wonder the Germans destroyed it, because as far as they're concerned, that is weapons that will be used to kill them. Who in their right mind would support that? Going to your enemy. And so to say Wilson's neutrality was horrible at best, if not outright utterly absurd to say, would be an understatement. Plain and simply, he was not a neutral leader. Now, when it comes to a war, there are those who are pro-peace, pro-war, etc. I can understand the isolationist mood of a lot of Americans during this time. I am of the pro-war camp, but here's what you want to do when there's a war or other big conflagration like this. When you pick a side, you gotta stick to it. For example, if you want peace, then neutral, completely and utterly neutral, no trade with either side, you do not get involved. Take your stuff, get it out of the war zone, and say, nope, we're not gonna do this, not our job. If it's war, what you do is you're going hard, loud, and fast. Get everyone in, start the fighting, finish it as quickly as possible, get the peace, and then return home. What Wilson did was right in the middle. Here's Wilson. And you see the problem. This wishy-washy stance makes everything worse. He prolonged the war by giving credit and arms to one side to make it harder for the others to keep going. All the while, he still is pushing a neutral stance. So he's not sending more men into the meat grinder or more troops to basically push things to the point where they can actually be won. Instead, what he's doing is, oh yeah, I want to be neutral, to be the peacemaker. But I also don't want those guys to lose, so you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to help them at the expense of our adversaries. If Wilson wanted to be the peacemaker, to get all of Europe to come to the US or negotiate under US supervision, if he was completely neutral, that could have worked. Because the US would look like an actual neutral party, you know? They're not supplying to either side, so when they say, hey, can we talk it out? I'll be the third-party mediator so that we can sort things out amicably. Well, then he'd be the perfect person for that. If instead he entered as a warring power and said, we're going to do this because I contributed to the war, I put blood on the table, I invested in this, we're going to have a peace based on my terms, that could have worked. Because he was so wishy-washy and refused to actually commit to a side, what ends up happening instead is no one wants to listen to him. The Germans don't view him as neutral at all. I mean, freak, he's the guy selling weapons to their enemies. And to the Entente, they're the guys who have been spending all the blood and sweat in this endeavor. Why the heck should America come in and start negotiating as if it's on a favorable term when it only sent 1 million versus them mobilizing their entire countries for war for literal years on end? That's the thing. When you deal with war policy, you gotta commit. You gotta say, do we want a war? Do we want peace? And then you go from there. If you decide to be neutral, like the US was in World War I and later World War II, then you're effectively gonna suffer because as much as you want to be neutral and have all the benefits of peace, you're actively getting some benefits of war, and so people aren't going to let you have those benefits of peace. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. If you are going to get involved in war and profit off it, you cannot then claim to be neutral, peaceful, and not take any blood. Funnily enough, a U.S. businessman was called the Merchant of Death for selling weapons to the Allies, the Entente powers. I feel like Wilson would be a far better person for that nickname, considering he's the guy who actually, allowed the Entente to buy from us. But let's go into the war actions. What did he do in the war? Well, number one, let's rip that band-aid off right away. The Sedition and Espionage Acts. Utterly terrible. I don't even need to explain why, for those who know. For those who don't, he basically made it illegal to criticize the government. If you had a belief that differed with the president's, you'd be arrested. There's a famous trade unionist, I'm blanking on the name right now. Oh, Eugene V. Debs. And he got arrested by the Wilson administration for merely critiquing its involvement with the war. In fact, he ran from prison against Wilson. Now, I'm not an agreeer with Debs' social beliefs. Not at all. Still, the fact that a man was arrested for disagreeing with the government, even if I believe his opinion was stupid, he still had an entire legal right to it. Wilson took that away. Now, yes, Congress passed it, but Wilson had veto powers. In fact, in his own views, he would likely be considered responsible, considering he believed firmly that the president should be this great person leading from the front in terms of policy, making decisions for people. The presidency to Wilson was the one that should have all the power. So for him, yes, I am sure he would absolutely consider those on him. This isn't like someone like, say, Calvin Coolidge or one of the more laid-back presidents who basically just follows what Congress is doing anyways. The fact is, this was, in Wilson's eyes, his government, and he let this pass. I shouldn't need to explain why that's a horrible thing. Now let's talk about his war measures. Other than that, which was honestly more just a general measure of domestic dissent crushing, there was also his cartelization of industry. Now, a lot of people might say, well, it's war, you gotta do a lot of things for war. One, the US was only at war for a few months. It's not like it would be that big a deal. That may sound a bit blunt to say, and a bit of an oversimplification, but really think about the US. We mobilized 1 million troops. Yes, a lot of people. Europe had tens of millions. That was nothing, especially for an economy that was eclipsing Britain. We weren't paying a lot of this, and frankly, the cartelization made it harder to pay for, because it makes prices more expensive. That's what a cartel does. The railroads were all bundled into one entity, managed by the government. A government which proceeded to mismanage things horribly. In fact, it was actually someone close to Wilson who got the job managing that, so yay, nepotism. Food, I can sort of get, given, you gotta feed people. I still object. I can sort of get it, though. Matter of fact, guess who was running that food cartel? Herbert Hoover. He was the guy managing food during the war. He would actually later use it, unrelated note, to help the Russians during their civil war as an act of charity. But these cartels basically screwed up the entire US economy. In fact, they created quite a bit of problems with the economy, as the government not only suffered from them, but also, when the war was over, and you're supposed to release all those wartime restraints during peacetime, these were attempted to keep going. People tried to keep moving these forwards. It didn't work, mind you. The cartels collapsed, but not only did they have a lasting impact on the economy, especially the trains, which basically destroyed much of our industry when it came to the trains, or at the very least crippled it to a notable extent. It also, among other things, heavily encouraged the government to spend much more money than it otherwise would have during the war. Now let's make some notes. These are the big things that he did that were bad. A lot of people like to bring up the Federal Reserve. They like to bring up the income tax and women's suffrage, either for good or bad. Also, just realized. Now, let's talk about these. As weird as it may say, I'm not going to hold any of these against Wilson or in favor of Wilson for a few simple reasons. One, basically every person who was running the ticket during Wilson's presidency wanted these things to come into existence. Remember, this is the progressive era. Theodore Roosevelt wanted women's suffrage, he wanted income tax, he wanted stuff like the Federal Reserve. This was going to happen regardless of who was president. That was just how the momentum was. Holding it against him doesn't really make much sense, especially when you consider that, let's face it, of all the things that you can safely say were going to happen whether he vetoed it or not, these are some of them. The government needed more revenue. I don't think Congress is just going to say, oh yeah, let's not increase our revenue on a sheer principle, despite the fact that we have a massive debt that we accrued helping the Allies in the war. They're not going to do that. Again, Federal Reserve, a lot of people want that for a while, especially the government. Go figure, it goes through. And women's suffrage had to be ratified by the states too. Yes, Wilson may try to take responsibility for them, and in his eyes, it may be under him. But if you remove Wilson, these are still happening. Without Wilson, you likely do not get these. This will happen regardless. This won't. And so, holding them against him, not really a thing I'm going to do. Neither am I going to praise him. Women's suffrage, I like. Meh. Federal Reserve, don't mind central banking as much as most people with free market ideas, so not as big of a problem with me, but still. Did do things with child labor? Yes. Do I agree that dealing with child labor and reducing it was a good idea? Yes, even if I'm a bit skeptical about the government of all people doing it. Go figure, I don't trust the people who did this and this managing our children. But still, the attempt was made. Then there was the start of Prohibition, which he did try to veto, so I'll give Prohibition to him there. But these are all domestic. We mentioned the war earlier. So, what about foreign affairs? Well, one, let's rip the band-aid off now. League of Nations. Now, it's not a bad idea inherently. The idea of getting a bunch of people together so that they can negotiate and end things before they escalate to further violence. Not a bad idea inherently. In fact, Europe actually had a similar thing called the Concert of Europe for a while, but it broke down under the strain of Germany and was, well, Europe doing it. So it didn't include a bunch of other people. But it had a few notable problems, including the quality of the people there, and specifically the lack thereof it. They wanted to include it, and by they, I mean most of the Japanese, Vietnamese, and other colonial peoples, to include a little oath that says, oh yeah, all nations are equal, and they're equal members. Did that go through? No, it did not. In fact, that was one of the big things that set out Japan and the U.S.'s relations before the 1920s, was the fact that the League of Nations, the U.S.'s big pet project, didn't really establish any equality. In fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still on the books. And so for a lot, and I do mean a lot of the Japanese, the U.S. just wasn't someone you really wanted to be associated with, other than the money, of course, but that's about it. And then there's, of course, just the weakness of it. It wasn't a strong group. And it further perpetuated British power. Needless to say, anyone who doesn't like the British, not a big fan of that. Now, it could have perpetuated American power. Some would still object, but it would have at least advanced Wilson's own interests as the head of a country. Or rather, his country's interests. It could have done that. But it didn't. Why? Well, for one, the U.S. didn't even join the League of Nations. In fact, they refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The U.S. had to negotiate separate pieces with Germany and Austria-Hungary, because what essentially happened was Wilson was unwilling to compromise with any of his other policies. And so when he tries to form the League of Nations, not only do Britain and France basically say, why are we doing this? They go along with it eventually, but still, they do have some objections to Wilson essentially asserting his own authority over what, they are doing because they were the ones who fought the war. Also, the Republicans at home, which, keep in mind, they were the guys who were against the war for the most part. Other than a few, like Theodore Roosevelt, they were not a fan of the war because they were the big ones who would just want to sell things. They weren't interested in getting involved directly. Well, they weren't compromising with Wilson because Wilson refused to compromise. So then they said, hey, if we work together, we'll ratify your League of Nations. In exchange, you give us some things politically. Wilson says, no, they don't ratify the League of Nations. They don't ratify the treaties that end the war. And they have to renegotiate different ones with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So that's one thing, the League of Nations. And it ends up boosting British power, as I said, because the League of Nations has this ability to make mandates, which basically say, hey, the League of Nations is going to have this country manage these people to prepare them for their eventual freedom. It was basically a colony in everything but name. And because the British were the largest power still in the League of Nations, guess who got the majority of the mandates? The British. The French got a lot too, for example, Syria, Lebanon, and a few German colonies. But overall, as far as anyone was concerned, the League of Nations controlling something was basically the same way someone might say the UN controlling something means it's for the United States. Same thing here. If the League of Nations says that it's an international territory, it basically meant British at the time. The UK controls it. And then there's, of course, the 14 points. Now, Wilson would go on to violate his 14 points, quite notably in the Russian Civil War. One of his points, Russia should be allowed a free choice in its own self-government, basic self-determination. He sent US troops into Russia. Now, I may not like the Soviets, I may believe that they should have been overthrown, but this blatant hypocrisy is hard to support when you are the one saying, we should do these 14 things, when what you do instead is the exact opposite. If he committed to his leaving Russia alone, I would still be annoyed, but I could at least respect the principle of it. He did not do that. He got involved with Russia. He also supported free trade, Poland's ability to trade without interference, and other such things. In fact, the 14 points were rather generous to the losing powers, all things considered, especially Germany, which is why they wanted the 14 points to be the basis of the negotiations, which Britain and France subsequently said no to, and Wilson basically threw Germany to the wolves just to get his League of Nations. And this created some issues, most notably the Polish corridor. Now, Wilson's idea for the taken territory was that it would be by referenda. So what France would do was they would carve out a territory, or Britain, and what was supposed to happen was the people who got that territory were supposed to have a referendum in it to basically say, do you want to join Germany? Do you want to join the new people? What do you want to do? They didn't really do this with a lot of them. For example, Alsace-Lorraine, that was just annexed outright. But also, it created quite a bit of issues in Germany's eastern territories because, for example, Danzig, literally one of the biggest cities in Prussia, with a German majority, was not allowed to have a referendum to join Germany or Poland. It was kept as an independent city, which is a fancy way of saying, yeah, it's on the League of Nations, so functionally Britain and Poland. It was a bit weird, Danzig. But also the Polish corridor wasn't really subject to referendum. It was given to Poland, so they had access to sea. I understand the reasoning, but it's a good way to, let's just say, annoy the Germans, who, keep in mind, Germany was not a weak power at this time. Even forced to demobilize, it may have been destroyed by the war, but it was still one of the largest economies in Europe. And under the principle of self-determination, which Wilson was supposed to be an advocate of, what happened instead was territories were just given to other countries. Needless to say, that's not a good thing, because it results in animosity. Now, it could have worked theoretically, but it really didn't with how it played out. Because if you say self-determination is how we should base our new borders, and then you don't give it to people, people are going to feel spited, and especially if they're one of the largest economies in Europe, that spite can very easily turn into a war that destroys entire countries. Needless to say, not good. 14 points. I get the execution, and I get the idea behind them and why they were wanted, just not efficient in how they were actually done. Now, adding on to that, as a brief side note, I can understand why a lot of people from smaller European states that got their independence through this and through the treaties that ended the war would like Wilson. Because again, self-determination. Very nice for your people. But for everyone else who wasn't, say, a Yugoslavian, or one of the many peoples that made up Yugoslavia more accurately, no one was really that much of a fan because it tended to result in a lot of bad blood. And then there's just the fact that Wilson, kind of had a stroke and just would not be able to serve his full term as president, yet people still treated him as the president. Which is why I would argue it's a bit weird that people advocate that Hillary was going to be our first president, because we already had a first female president. Her name was Edith Wilson. She basically ran the country while Wilson was busy, recovering from stroke. She might as well have been our first female president. It ain't like Wilson was doing anything. And so that's generally a critique of Wilson's policies. He did some good, I won't deny that, just some labor reforms, some general good things. He had some progressive policies, I won't deny that. Whether you agree with the policies or not my call, but while he had some good things, as you can see, a vast majority of this, not good. And then there's some that are really dependent on your general beliefs. For example, he regularly engaged in imperialism in South America, North America, and basically everywhere that wasn't the US. For example, he invaded Mexico in the Mexican expedition to catch Ponce de Villa, regularly got involved in Central America, Haiti. Actually, that might have been Theodore Roosevelt for Haiti, but regardless. He was regularly involved in imperialist actions. And also, let's face it, dude was just a mess. Now, you could say he did some good. Yes. These you might call good. Depending on how you stand on imperialism, you might call this good. But he just was a negative overall. Because throughout his 8 years of presidency, keep in mind, 2-term president, he wasn't even like FDR where he had 4 terms to pave the way for the country. 2 terms, average length of presidency. And he swerved us straight into one of the worst foreign and domestic policy situations I have ever seen in a president, as in observed through my linear history. You don't mess up this bad without utterly failing as a president. Genuinely. It's one of the things where I would have to say he is the worst, if not one of the worst presidents of all time. Some things were more inevitable than others. These things were likely to happen regardless. Prohibition, you can make a very real argument that it was going to happen. These things, similar to above, but Wilson did push them through a bit more aggressively. And this, if TR was elected, if Theodore Roosevelt was, this would likely happen too. But all of this combined, and with Wilson actively supporting several of these, making them worse in many occasions, and just generally being bad at doing any level of good for his country, it's kind of hard to argue that he was a good president. Heck, even that he was a decent president. I know I'm gonna rant a bit extra here, but it's one thing when you're Buchanan, you know, do nothing, you're not doing much sort of president. That's one thing. Even when things are going bad, a do nothing isn't making things worse. It's another when things are going decent, and you manage to successfully screw it up to such an extent that Jim Crow got worse, the KKK rose, war came to your doorstep knowingly, your own constitution was violated multiple times, your economy was ruined, prohibition, it's freaky prohibition, and you set up one of the worst foreign policies for anyone to clean up of all time, really. Like, it's kind of hard to screw up this bad. Because Wilson basically paved the way for World War II, at least for the US. Because if you promise people things like self-determination, freedom, liberty, making the world safe for democracy, and then you deliver none of it while still standing above a bunch of others, people are going to get freaking angry. And so Wilson, needless to say, was an utterly horrible president. That'll be all.